The observation deck hummed with nervous energy as I, Commander V of the Corvian Military Academy, watched 30 of the finest cadets from across the galaxy file into the training arena. Their scales gleamed, their tentacles twitched with anticipation, and their compound eyes reflected the harsh overhead lights. This was supposed to be a routine demonstration, a simple lesson in tactical suppression and combat discipline. Then the human walked in. He was underwhelming. That's the word, completely, utterly underwhelming. While our cadets stood in perfect formation, their combat suits pristine and sensor arrays calibrated to perfection, this human shuffled forward in what appeared to be recycled military fatigues that had seen better decades. His hair stuck up at odd angles, suggesting he'd either just woken up or simply didn't care, probably both. He carried a duffel bag that looked like it had survived a small war, which, knowing humans, it probably had. Cadets, I announced through the intercom, my voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of military service. Today you will learn the finer points of hostage extraction and territorial control. Your opponent is Instructor Marcus Webb, on loan from the Terran Defense Coalition. He will be playing the role of an entrenched enemy combatant. I watched as several cadets exchanged glances. A few of their translator implants caught fragments of their whispered conversations. That's the human, looks half asleep. This will be over in minutes. Oh, how wrong they were. How gloriously, magnificently wrong. Marcus, this disheveled representative of humanity, dropped his duffel bag on the ground with a heavy thunk that echoed through the arena. He stretched, his joints popping audibly, and then looked up at the observation deck. He waved, actually waved, like we were old friends meeting for lunch instead of conducting a military exercise. All right, he called out, his voice rough like gravel being sorted. Which one of you bright sparks is in charge of this operation? Cadet Threx, a Vorlian with excellent tactical scores and a family legacy of military service stretching back 6 generations, stepped forward, his chest plates puffed out with confidence. I am designated team leader for this exercise, human. We have analyzed your species combat patterns and developed 17 counter strategies. Marcus nodded slowly, that infuriating half smile playing across his lips. 17, huh? That's real thorough, real professional. Tell me something, Threx. Was it how many of those strategies account for the fact that I don't give a damn about patterns? The cadet's translator seemed to struggle with that last phrase, cycling through several possible interpretations before settling on one that made his scales ripple with confusion. The exercise begins in 60 seconds. I announced. Cadets, your objective is to breach the fortified position and neutralize the target. Instructor Webb, you have standard defensive equipment and 1 hour to prepare your position. Any questions? Yeah, Marcus said, already pulling things out of his duffel bag. You got any coffee around here? Doesn't have to be good coffee. Hell, doesn't even have to be hot, just coffee. Negative, I responded, fighting the urge to laugh. You have 50 seconds. Figures, he muttered, and then something changed. The slouching, disheveled human transformed before our eyes. His movements became economical, precise. He pulled out rolls of fiber wire, small boxes I couldn't identify, packets of what looked like common sand, and began setting up his defensive position with the kind of speed that spoke of muscle, memory beaten into existence through repetition and survival. The cadets watched, some with fascination, others with barely concealed amusement. Cadet Threx barked orders, organizing his team into 3 assault groups with supporting fire positions, by the book, exactly as their training dictated. 30 seconds, I called out. Marcus finished whatever he was doing and settled into a depression in the terrain that barely qualified as cover. He looked up one more time, gave another casual wave, and then seemed to melt into the landscape. I had to check my sensors twice to confirm he was still there. Begin. What happened next would be discussed in tactical analysis classes for years to come. What happened next would fundamentally alter how we trained our military forces. What happened next proved beyond any doubt that humanity's reputation wasn't exaggeration or propaganda. It was warning. The first assault group, led by Cadet Threx himself, moved forward in textbook formation, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, proper use of cover and concealment. They advanced 20 m, 30, 40. Nothing happened. The human's position remained silent. He's abandoned his post, one cadet whispered. Tactical error, another agreed. Humans are known for cowardice when facing superior numbers. I said nothing. I'd read the human's file. Marcus Webb had 17 years of combat experience across 4 separate conflicts. He'd been decorated 6 times for valor under fire and 3 times for actions that his own military classified as inadvisable but effective. The phrase alone should have been warning enough. 50 M60. The first assault group was almost on top of the defensive position when it happened. The explosion wasn't large. In fact, by military standards, it was barely a firecracker, but it wasn't designed to kill. The small char Marcus had buried sent a cloud of that common sand he'd packed into the air, combined with something that made it hang there like fog. The cadets' sophisticated sensor arrays, calibrated for maximum sensitivity, immediately whited out. Sensors compromised. Threx reported, his voice steady despite the surprise. Switching to visual spectrum, advancing on target. That's when the screaming started. Not real screaming, mind you. Marcus had rigged up some kind of audio device that blasted sound across every frequency the cadets' communication system used, not white noise which their filters could have handled. No, this was specifically calibrated chaos. Music, human laughter, what sounded like historical battle recordings, all layered over each other in a cacophony that made coordinated communication impossible. Through my observation equipment, I watched the assault team's careful formation dissolve into confusion. They could see each other, but they couldn't coordinate. Each cadet became an individual unit, making individual decisions, and that's exactly what Marcus wanted. The fiber wire he'd strung at ankle height took down 3 cadets in quick succession. Not injurious. The training safeties ensured that, but it triggered their suits' elimination protocols. They were out of the exercise, their armor glowing red to indicate casualties. 7% casualties in the first engagement. My assistant, Lieutenant Krell, noted with academic interest. Impressive use of environmental manipulation. We haven't seen anything yet, I replied. Marcus burst from a position 15 m away from where we'd last tracked him. How he'd moved without detection, I still Don't know, he was carrying something that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and optimism. Later analysis would reveal it was a projectile launcher loaded with paint rounds, but in the moment it looked absolutely terrifying. He fired 6 rounds in rapid succession while moving laterally across the battlefield, each round splattered bright orange paint across cadet visors, blinding them without technically harming them. The training system registered it as suppressing fire, forcing the affected cadets to seek cover and attempt cleanup. Second group flank left, Threx ordered, his command barely audible through the audio chaos. Third group suppressing fire, the second assault group showing admirable initiative, split from the main force and attempted to circle around Marcus' last known position. They moved quickly, using terrain features for cover, weapons ready. Marcus let them come. When they were committed to their flanking maneuver, he triggered another one of his surprises, small charges he'd buried along their approach route went off in sequence, each one releasing more of that sensor disrupting sand cloud. The charges were timed perfectly, cutting the flanking team off from visual contact with their main force and forcing them into an increasingly narrow corridor of approach. It's a funnel, Krello said quietly. He's hurting them. At the end of that funnel, Marcus had set up a simple but devastatingly effective trap. More fiber wire, this time rigged to spring up when triggered, created a web that the flanking team ran straight into. Their momentum carried them forward, tangling them together in a mass of limbs and confused shouting. 8 more casualties, 15 total out of 30 in less than 10 minutes. How is he tracking their movements without sensors? One of my fellow instructors asked. The sand cloud should blind him as well. I pulled up Marcus's bio one more time, scanning for details I might have missed. There it was, buried in his service record. Before joining the military, he'd grown up in some place called Alaska, a region on Earth known for its harsh environment and apparently for teaching its inhabitants to navigate by sound, smell, and pure instinct. When visibility dropped to nothing, the human wasn't using technology to track the cadets. He was using skills that predated their civilization by millennia. Threx, to his credit, recognized the deteriorating situation and called for a tactical withdrawal. The remaining cadets pulled back to regroup, dragging their eliminated teammates with them in a show of unit cohesion that would have made me proud under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Marcus wasn't about to let them regroup. The human emerged from the sand cloud like some kind of mythical beast from ancient stories. His face was covered in grit, his clothes were filthy, and he was grinning. Actually grinning like this was the most fun he'd had in years. He'd ditched the projectile launcher and now carried 2 training knives, the kind that registered contact but couldn't cut. He moved through the withdrawing cadets like water flowing downhill, always taking the path of least resistance, striking from blind spots, using their own body positions against them. Corvian cadet, easily twice Marcus. Mass turned to engage him. Marcus didn't try to match strength with strength. Instead, he dropped low, used the cadet's own momentum to throw him off balance, and tapped both knives against vulnerable points that the training system registered as kill shots. Another elimination, a Thyan Cadet with 4 arms tried to grapple him. Marcus somehow ended up behind her, using her own arms as levers to control her movement before depositing her gently on the ground with both knives pressed against her dorsal plates. Another elimination. "This is a massacre," Krell whispered. And he wasn't wrong. Threx backed into corner with only 5 cadets still. Combat effective made a decision that showed why he'd been selected as team leader. He called for a full assault. No more tactics, no more clever maneuvers. Just overwhelming force applied directly to the problem. The 6 remaining cadets charged as one unit, weapons firing, suppressing paint rounds, closing the distance to prevent Marcus from using his mobility advantage. It was desperate, aggressive, and under normal circumstances it would have worked. Marcus dropped flat to the ground. The cadets suppressing fire passed over him harmlessly. Their charge carried them forward 3 steps before he rolled sideways, came up inside their formation, and began the most efficient demonstration of close-quarters combat I'd ever witnessed. He moved between them like he knew exactly where each cadet would be before they knew themselves. Knives flashing, feet sweeping, elbows striking. Every movement served multiple purposes, defending against one opponent while attacking another, using defeated cadets as shields against those still fighting. In 30 seconds it was over. 30 cadets from the finest military families across the galaxy, with decades of combined training and genetic advantages that made them naturally superior warriors, lay scattered across the training field, every single one eliminated, every single one beaten by a single human who looked like he'd rather be drinking coffee and taking a nap. Marcus stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard but still standing. He looked up at the observation deck and shrugged. So he called out, his voice carrying clearly. Now that the audio interference had stopped, when do the real students get here? The observation deck was silent. Absolutely silent. Even the automated system seemed to have stopped breathing. I activated my communicator. Instructor Webb, report to the observation deck for debriefing. Can I shower first? I've got sand in places. Sand really shouldn't be. Negative. Immediately he sighed but started walking toward the access lift below. The cadets were picking themselves up, checking their equipment, and very carefully not looking at each other. The shame of losing wasn't just about the defeat, it was about how thoroughly, how completely they'd been outclassed. When Marcus entered the observation deck, he looked even worse up close. Grit from the sand covered every exposed surface. His hair had achieved new levels of chaos, and he smelled like he'd been rolling in dirt for the past hour, which technically he had been. Commander, he said, nodding respectfully, despite his appearance. Explain, I said simply. Explain what? The exercise. They did everything by the book, which was their first mistake. Books get written after wars are over, by people trying to make sense of chaos and turn it into something teachable. But war, real war, doesn't follow books. It follows physics, psychology, and whatever advantages you can scrape together from nothing. You anticipated every move they made, Krell said accusingly. How? Marcus shrugged. Because I've seen it before. That's the thing about doctrine and training. It creates patterns, and patterns can be predicted. Sure, my approach was sloppy and improvised, but sloppy and improvised beats predictable and precise every single time. The audio interference, I Pressed the sand clouds, the psychological warfare, none of that was in the approved training manual. Yeah, well, my enemies don't usually stick to the approved training manual. Either, he scratched his head, sending a small cascade of sand onto our clean floor. Look, your cadets are good. Really good, in a stand-up fight with clear sightlines and rules of engagement. They'd probably wipe the floor with me, but wars aren't fought like that. Wars are fought in mud and darkness and confusion by people who are tired and scared and running on muscle memory and spite. Spite, I asked. Spite, he confirmed. Absolute refusal to lose just because losing would be easier. Your cadets fought with skill and honor and discipline, all good things. But they didn't fight with spite, and sometimes spite is what keeps you alive when skill runs out. Lieutenant Krell pulled up tactical recordings of the engagement. The funnel trap. How did you know they would take that approach route? Because it was the tactically sound choice. Good cover, concealment from my position, the ability to hit me from an unexpected angle. Of course they'd take it, so I made it look even more appealing, then made them pay for doing the smart thing. That's devious, I said, not entirely sure if I meant it as a compliment or criticism. That's survival, Marcus corrected. Every trap I set, every dirty trick I used, learned from someone who was trying to kill me, and the only reason I'm here to teach it is because I learned faster and used it better. He paused, his expression growing serious. Your cadets need to understand something fundamental about humans. We didn't get to the top of our food chain by being the strongest, or the fastest, or having the best natural weapons. We got there by being willing to do whatever it takes to win. We turned rocks into tools, tools into weapons, weapons into systems of warfare, so complex that entire civilizations developed just to manage them. You make your species sound ruthless, Krell observed. We can be, Marcus agreed, but here's the thing, we're also the species that'll charge into a burning building to save a stranger's pet. We'll share our last ration with a wounded enemy. We'll cry over stories that never happen about people who never existed. We're walking contradictions, capable of incredible cruelty and impossible compassion, often in the same afternoon. He walked over to the window overlooking the training field where the cadets were still gathering their equipment and treating their wounded pride. Those kids down there, they're warriors. They're exactly what their societies need them to be, but if you ever send them against humans in a real fight, they're going to die, not because they're not good enough, but because being good enough isn't enough when you're fighting someone who's willing to be bad. The silence that followed his words was heavy with implications. The galactic community had welcomed humanity, cautiously, aware of their reputation, but hoping it was exaggerated. Standing here watching footage of 30 elite cadets being systematically dismantled by one tired, disheveled human using improvised equipment and guerrilla tactics, that hope seemed naive. What would you have us teach them? I asked finally. Marcus turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I saw the weight he carried, the years of combat, the lives he'd taken and lost, the choices that had kept him alive but cost pieces of his humanity. Teach them that warfare isn't about honor or glory or fighting fair. Those are luxuries you indulge when you're winning. Real warfare is about making your enemy quit, whether that's through superior tactics, psychological pressure, or just convincing them that continuing the fight costs more than surrender. Teach them to be unpredictable, adaptable, and willing to use every advantage, no matter how small or undignified. And if that turns them into something their societies don't recognize, challenged, then their societies need to decide what they want more: warriors who fight clean and lose, or warriors who survive to come home. He paused, but here's the real lesson, the one that matters most. Teach them when not to fight. Teach them that the best victory is the one you never have to risk achieving, because once you start down the path of doing whatever it takes to win, once you embrace the controlled madness that makes you effective in war, it's really hard to find your way back to being the person you were before. I studied this human, this representative of a species that had clawed its way from primitive hunter-gatherers to space-faring civilization in an evolutionary eye-link. Behind his casual demeanor and self-deprecating humor, I saw what made humans dangerous. Not their technology or their tactics, but their willingness to do what needed doing, to carry the weight of difficult choices, to become monsters so their people didn't have to. The second demonstration is tomorrow, I said. Same scenario, but this time you'll be instructing the cadets on your methods. Marcus' expression shifted to something that might have been relief or concern or both. You sure about that, Commander? Once I show them how to fight dirty, there's no unknowing it. I'm sure my responsibility is to send these cadets home alive when they face real combat. If that means learning from the monsters, then so be it. He nodded slowly. All right then, but I'm going to need a lot of coffee for tomorrow and maybe a shower, definitely a shower. As he left the observation deck, trailing sand and radiating exhaustion, Lieutenant Krell turned to me with concern evident in his voice. Are we making a mistake, teaching our future officers to abandon honor and discipline? No, I said, pulling up the tactical footage one more time. We're teaching them reality. Honor and discipline matter, but they matter most when applied by warriors who survive long enough to practice them. The human is right. We've been training our cadets for the wars we wish we were fighting, instead of the wars we actually face. Below, the cadets had formed up in their original formation, minus their pride and several illusions about their preparedness for real combat. Cadet Threx stood at attention, his scales still showing the orange stains from Marcus paint rounds. He was speaking to his team, probably analyzing their performance, identifying mistakes, planning corrections. Good, that's exactly what a leader should do. But tomorrow, when Marcus taught them the darker arts of warfare, when he showed them the tricks and traps and psychological weapons that humans had refined over millennia of killing each other in increasingly creative ways, Threx and his cadets would learn something more valuable than tactics. They would learn respect for the species that fought like cornered animals, because from their perspective they'd always been cornered, the species that turned everything from their environment to their enemies' expectations into weapons, the species that looked at the concept of a fair fight and decided it was just another rule to break when survival was at stake. Tomorrow, 30 elite cadets would begin their real education in warfare. Tonight, I needed to file a report that would fundamentally alter our training protocols and possibly our strategic assessment of humanity's military capabilities, and somewhere in the academy's guest quarters, a disheveled human instructor was probably standing under a shower, washing away sand and blood, and the memories that came with teaching young warriors how to survive in a universe that didn't care about their honor or their courage or their perfectly executed tactical maneuvers, only about their willingness to do whatever it took to see another sunrise. I began writing my report, choosing words carefully, knowing that this single training exercise had revealed a truth about humanity that many in the galactic community would rather not face. They weren't just another species with interesting technology and useful diplomatic connections. They were apex predators wearing the mask of civilization, and they just agreed to teach our children how to hunt. The morning briefing room felt smaller, with Marcus Webb standing at the front, holding a cup of something that barely qualified as coffee, but which he drank anyway with the dedication of a religious ritual. The 30 cadets sat in absolute silence, their postures rigid, their eyes fixed on the human who had systematically dismantled them less than 20 hours ago. He looked better, cleaner. At least, his hair was still a disaster, but his uniform was pressed and his boots were polished to a shine that suggested muscle memory more than conscious effort. He set the coffee down and studied them for a long moment before speaking. So he began, his voice carrying that same gravel rough quality. Who wants to tell me what went wrong yesterday? Silence, the kind of heavy, uncomfortable silence that filled rooms when nobody wanted to be first to admit failure. Nobody really. Marcus leaned against the podium completely at ease. Fine, I'll tell you, you lost because you thought this was a test of skill. It wasn't. It was a test of adaptation, and you adapted like rocks trying to become water. Didn't work out great, did it? Cadet Threx raised one manipulator. Appendage, permission to speak. Instructor. Granted, also dropped the formal stuff. Just talk. You fought without honor. Every technique you employed violated standard combat protocols and ethical warfare guidelines established by the Galactic Military Accord of Cycle 30,042. Marcus nodded slowly, that infuriating half-smile returning. You're absolutely right, I cheated. Basically used every dirty trick I know. Want to guess why? To demonstrate human tactical superiority. Ventured Adraxian cadet named Kelvor, his mandibles clicking with barely suppressed irritation. Nope, to keep you alive. Marcus pushed off from the podium and walked down the center aisle between the seated cadets. See, here's the thing about honor and protocols and all that beautiful civilized combat theory you've been taught. Your enemies don't care. Not even a little bit. The pirate who ambushes your convoy won't check the manual first. The insurgent planting explosives on your supply route won't worry about violating established guidelines. They'll do whatever works. And if you're standing there consulting your tactical data pad about proper engagement protocols, you'll be dead before you finish reading. He stopped in front of a Quellan cadet, a female with bioluminescent patterns that shifted colors with her emotion. State, currently they were pulsing in embarrassed amber. What's your name? Cadet Lysa. Instructor Lysa. Good name, simple, easy to yell when things go sideways. He crouched down to her eye level. Yesterday, you were part of the flanking group. You walked straight into my trap. Why? Her pattern shifted to Defensive blue. The approach route offered optimal cover and concealment, with minimal exposure to your firing. Position. Exactly, you did the smart thing though. Train thing, the thing your instructors taught you was correct, and it got you killed. You know what you should have done? What instructor? The stupid thing, the reckless thing. You should have charged straight up the middle with zero cover, screaming your head off, making yourself the biggest, loudest target possible. He stood up, addressing the entire room, because I was expecting smart. I'd prepared for smart. Stupid would have caught me completely off guard, and in combat, surprise beats preparation 9 times out of 10. Cadet Threx's scales rippled with confusion, but that violates every principle of tactical advancement and self-preservation. Sure does. It also violates enemy expectations, which is worth more than armor sometimes. Marcus walked back to the front of the room. Look, I'm not saying abandon your training. Your fundamentals are solid, really solid, but you need to understand that fundamentals are your starting point, not your ending point. Real combat requires you to know when to follow the rules and when to set the rule book on fire and use it to confuse your enemy. He pulled up a holographic display showing yesterday's engagement from multiple angles. Let's break down what actually happened versus what you thought happened. First contact, the sand cloud explosion. Threx, what did you assume? My objective was to disable our sensors and create concealment for repositioning. Wrong. My objective was to make you assume exactly that, then waste time and energy adapting to a problem that was already solved. Marcus highlighted several cadet positions on the display. You switched to visual spectrum, which is fine, good adaptive response, but then you kept advancing on my last known position like I'd still be there. Why would I stick around after announcing my location with an explosion? The question hung in the air unanswered. Because you expected me to defend. That's what the exercise parameters stated. Defend the position, repel the assault, but I never actually defended anything. I controlled the battlefield by making you react to me instead of executing your own plan. Every move you made was a response to something I'd already done, which meant I was always 2 steps ahead. Lieutenant Krell, observing from the back of the room, leaned forward with interest. You're describing asymmetric warfare theory. I'm describing Tuesday. Marcus corrected. Asymmetric warfare is just a fancy term for refusing to fight on your enemy's terms. Humans are really good at it because we spent most of our history being smaller, weaker, and slower than the things trying to eat us. We survived by being tricky, vindictive, and too stubborn to die quietly. He advanced the holographic playback to the moment when the flanking team hit his funnel trap. This is important. Kelvor, you led the flanking element. Walk me through your decision-making process. The Draxian cadet stood, his exoskeleton clicking as he shifted weight. We identified a weakness in your defensive perimeter. The eastern approach offered multiple covered positions and allowed us to attack from your blind side. Textbook flanking maneuver, high probability of success. And it would have worked against any enemy following conventional defensive tactics. Marcus agreed, but I knew you knew that, so I made it look even better than it actually was. That's called bait, and you took it like hungry fish. No offense. Some taken, Kelvor muttered, sitting back down. Marcus grinned. Good means You're paying attention. Here's the lesson. In warfare, if something looks too good, it probably is. Your instincts were screaming at you that the approach was perfect, right? Perfect cover, perfect angle of attack, perfect opportunity. That's exactly when you should stop and ask yourself, why is this perfect? Who made it perfect, and what am I not seeing? A Vorlian cadet named Prin raised a tentacle, but if we question every tactical opportunity, we'll never take decisive action. Analysis paralysis leads to defeat as surely as poor planning. You're not wrong, Marcus acknowledged. That's the balance. Knowing when to trust your training and when to trust your gut feeling that something's hinky. It comes with experience, usually the kind of experience you get from barely surviving your own mistakes. He pulled up a different image, this one showing his impromptu weapon, the projectile launcher he'd assembled from spare parts. Let's talk about improvisation. Anyone recognize what this was made from? Silence again, but this time it felt more thoughtful than defensive. That's a hydration pack pressure chamber, 3 lengths of conduit pipe, a compression spring from a bunk mattress, and the trigger mechanism from a waste disposal unit. Total cost may be 5 credits worth of common materials. Effectiveness, 60% reduction in enemy combat efficiency through vision impairment and psychological impact. He let that sink in. Your standard issue weapons are better in every measurable way. Better range, better accuracy, better everything, but they're also standardized, which means your enemies know exactly what they do, what their limitations are, and how to counter them. This ridiculous thing I built, nobody had any idea what it was or what it would do, and that uncertainty made it more effective than its actual capabilities warranted. Cadet Threx's scales had shifted to a contemplative green. You're suggesting we abandon standardized equipment. I'm suggesting you understand that equipment is just a tool, and tools can be improvised when necessary. What happens if you lose your weapon? What happens if your ammunition runs out? What happens when your fancy sensor array gets fried by an electromagnetic pulse? Can you still fight, or do you just surrender because your toys stopped working? The uncomfortable shifting among the cadets suggested most had never seriously considered those scenarios. Humans have a saying, Marcus continued. If the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem starts looking like a nail. Your training has given you an arsenal of hammers, beautiful, well-made, perfectly balanced hammers. But some problems need screwdrivers, some need wrenches, and some need you to hit them with a rock you found on the ground, because all your proper tools are somewhere else. He walked over to a storage locker and pulled out various objects: a length of rope, a metal canteen, several elastic bands, a reflective emergency blanket, and what appeared to be a broken communication device. 30 seconds. Tell me how many weapons you can make from these materials. The cadet stared at the collection like he'd asked them to build a starship from kitchen supplies nobody really fine. Marcus picked up the rope, tripwire snare, trap climbing aid, makeshift tourniquet, or grow if things get really personal. He grabbed the canteen, projectile noise maker container for improvised explosives or chemical agent, signaling device if you catch sunlight, right, the emergency blanket, vision obstruction, heat signature, masking shelter, water collection, signaling device, or cut it into strips, For cordage, he tossed the broken communicator in the air and caught it. Salvaged the battery for electrical. Traps use the casing for shrapnel. The circuit board has components for multiple improvised devices, and if you're really creative, you can rig it to broadcast false signals. The room was completely silent now, but it was the silence of minds working, connections forming, paradigms shifting. Every single thing in your environment is a potential asset or weapon, Marcus said quietly. Every single thing. Terrain, whether time of day, enemy. Expectations, your own perceived. Weaknesses, all of it can be turned to advantage if you're willing to think sideways instead of straight ahead. Lieutenant Krell stood up from his observation position. Instructor Webb, what you're describing sounds less like military tactics and more like survival techniques from primitive civilizations. Marcus' expression went flat. Lieutenant, my primitive civilization fought wars on 6 continents simultaneously while your people were still figuring out metal working. We've had submarines, aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, and orbital strike platforms. We've fought in deserts, jungles, mountains, tundra, urban environments, and underwater. We've faced human enemies who knew all our tricks and still found ways to surprise them. So yeah, some of our most effective techniques look primitive because they work regardless of technology level, which means they'll keep working when your fancy technology fails, which it will, usually at the worst possible moment. The lieutenant's translator struggled briefly with the intensity of Marcus' tone before settling on a diplomatic interpretation. Krell sat back down without further comment. Right, Marcus said, his casual demeanor returning like he hadn't just verbally demolished a superior officer. Let's talk about psychological warfare. Yesterday, the audio interference. What was the actual tactical value? Lysa's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to curious yellow. It disrupted our communications and prevented coordinated responses. Partial credit, the real value was making you angry, frustrated, and stressed. Angry opponents make mistakes. Frustrated opponents take unnecessary risk. Stressed opponents lose fine motor control and cognitive function. I didn't just block your communications, I attacked your emotional state and watch it cascade into tactical failures. He pulled up footage of several cadets looking around in confusion during the audio assault. See Prin here. Normally he's your team's designated marksman, right? Steady hands, excellent accuracy, but watch what happens when he can't communicate with his spotter. His accuracy drops 40%. Not because the noise physically affected his aim, but because the stress of isolation degraded his performance. That's what psychological warfare does. It turns your strengths into weaknesses by attacking the mental foundation they're built on. That seems cruel, observed a Thyan cadet named Hexra. It is cruel, Marcus agreed without hesitation. Warfare is cruel, people die, horrible, and pointless and cruel. If I can make you quit through psychological pressure instead of lethal force, I've saved both our lives. That's not cruelty, that's mercy wearing an ugly mask. The philosophical implications of that statement settled over the room like heavy gravity. Final lesson for today, Marcus said, his tone shifting to something almost gentle. Everything I've taught you this morning, every dirty trick and psychological manipulation and improvised weapon, there's something more important than All of it combined. Knowing when not to use any of it, Cadet. Threx looked up sharply. Explain. The goal of warfare isn't to win fights. It's to achieve objectives that serve your people's interests. Sometimes that means fighting, sometimes that means talking, sometimes that means walking away and finding a completely different approach. The most dangerous warriors aren't the ones who always fight. They're the ones who fight when necessary, negotiate when possible, and always keep their ultimate goals in focus. He sat down on the edge of the podium, suddenly looking very tired. I've been in 17 major combat operations. You know what I'm most proud of? The 3 times I managed to accomplish my mission without firing a single shot. Those are the wins that matter. The ones where everybody goes home. Fights, even the ones you win, those cost you maybe not your life, but pieces of yourself, bits of humanity you can't get back. The cadets sat in silence, and for the first time I saw them looking at Marcus not as an opponent or instructor, but as something more complex, a warrior who carried victories and defeats with equal weight, who understood that survival sometimes meant compromise, and who taught them how to be dangerous specifically so they might avoid having to prove it. All right, Marcus said, standing up and finishing the last of his terrible coffee. Practical exercise time. You're going to split into teams of 3. Each team gets a scenario where conventional tactics won't work. You'll have 1 hour to develop an asymmetric approach. Then we'll test them. Losing team cleans the entire barracks for a week. The groans of protest were immediate and wonderfully normal. Marcus just grinned. Over the next 6 hours, I watched those 30 elite cadets transform, not into humans, they could never be that, but into something more flexible than they'd been. They learned to look at problems from angles their training hadn't covered. They discovered creative solutions hidden in limitations. They found that sometimes the best answer was the one that made no sense until it worked. Cadet Threx's team developed a scenario resolution that involved faking a technical malfunction to draw enemy forces out of position. When Marcus questioned the ethics, Threx responded with words that could have come from the human's own mouth. Ethics matter most when applied by warriors who survive to practice them. Marcus had smiled at that, a real smile, without the sarcasm or weariness. You're getting it. By the time evening arrived and the cadets filed out, exhausted and intellectually stretched in ways they hadn't experienced before, Lieutenant Krell approached me with obvious concern. Commander, are we certain this is the path we want to take, teaching our future officers to think like humans? No, I admitted, but I'm certain that sending them into combat with only theoretical knowledge and honorable intentions is a faster path to memorial ceremonies and grieving families. Webb didn't teach them to abandon honor. He taught them to survive long enough that their honor means something. Down in the now empty briefing room, Marcus was collecting his materials, moving slowly like every one of his years pressed down with physical weight. I descended to speak with him privately. Instructor Webb, he turned and I saw exhaustion in his eyes that went deeper than lack of sleep. Commander, they did good today, really good. Some of them are naturals at this kind of thinking. That concerns you? Yeah, he admitted. Because I remember being their age, thinking war was this noble thing. The righteous prevailed and justice was served. Then I learned what war actually is what it costs, what it turns you into. Those kids, they're good people. Teaching them to fight dirty means they'll survive, but surviving changes. Would you prefer we left them unprepared? No, but I wouldn't prefer the alternative either. That's the thing about reality. It doesn't care about our preferences. He gathered his materials into his battered duffel bag. Your cadets are going to be formidable, genuinely scary once they integrate these techniques with their existing skills. The galaxy should probably be grateful they're on the side of law and order. And if they weren't, Marcus looked at me directly, and in that moment I understood why his service record carried so many classified sections. Then you'd have a problem even humans would struggle to solve, which, come to think of it, is probably the best possible deterrent to anyone starting conflicts with your alliance. Nobody wants to fight enemies who learned from us how to bend rules that weren't even written yet. He walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back. Commander, one last thing. Whatever reports you file about human military capabilities, whatever strategic assessments your analysts develop based on this training, remember something important, which is everything I taught them: the improvisation and psychological warfare and tactical flexibility. That's just survival skills we developed for fighting each other. Humans have been at war with humans for our entire history. We're really good at it because we've had thousands of years of practice against opponents who think exactly like us. Your cadets has learned 2 days of techniques from one tired instructor. Imagine what a full human military unit could do with proper planning and motivation. The implications settled into my consciousness like ice water. Marcus wasn't boasting or threatening. He was stating facts with the same tone someone might use to describe weather patterns or orbital mechanics. I'll include that in my assessment, I said quietly. Good. Wouldn't want anyone making the mistake of thinking we're weak just because we're friendly. Humans can be both. That's what makes us complicated. He headed for the exit again, then called back over his shoulder. Same time tomorrow. I'm supposed to teach them basic escape and evasion techniques. Confirmed. Will you need any special equipment? Nah, maybe some rope, couple of chairs, and a blindfold or two. Oh, and definitely more coffee. The good stuff this time if you've got it. I've got standards, low ones but standards. After he left, I stood alone in the briefing room, surrounded by the holographic displays still showing footage from yesterday's exercise. 30 of our finest dismantled by one human using improvised equipment and tactics that predated space flight. Lieutenant Krell entered carrying data tablets filled with analysis reports. Initial assessments are complete, Commander. Every military strategist who reviewed the engagement reached the same conclusion, which is that humans are significantly more dangerous than our intelligence previously suggested, not because of superior technology or numbers, but because of their fundamental approach to conflict resolution. They don't just fight battles, they fight everything, always using any available means. It's not aggression exactly, it's more like perpetual adaptation with violent applications when necessary. I took the reports and skimmed the summaries. Phrases jumped out: innovative threat assessment, asymmetric advantages, psychological warfare, mastery, environmental exploitation, technological improvisation, Ethical flexibility. That last one bothered me. Krell'll do. You think we made a mistake bringing Webb here? My assistant considered the question carefully. No, Commander, but I think we may have made a mistake underestimating how much we didn't know about human military capabilities. They've been polite neighbors and reliable allies, so we assumed that represented the full scope of their nature. Webb showed us that politeness and reliability are choices they make, not limitations they have, and if those choices change, then the galaxy has a problem that can't be solved through conventional military responses. Because you can't beat an opponent who will turn your own tactics against you, who will improvise weapons from your environment, who will exploit psychological weaknesses you didn't know you had, and who will do all of it while genuinely believing they're the victims, defending themselves. I filed the reports, made my official recommendations, and went home that evening thinking about lessons learned and paradigms shifted. The Corvian Military Academy would integrate Webb's teachings into our standard curriculum. Other armies across the Alliance would follow. Our future officers would be better prepared for the realities of combat, more adaptable, more dangerous. Whether that made the galaxy safer or more dangerous remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: we would never again make the assumption that humanity's friendliness equated to weakness, or that their preference for peace meant inability for war. Marcus Webb, disheveled instructor with questionable coffee standards and a duffel bag full of improvised chaos, had taught us that single indelible lesson. Humans came to the galaxy bringing medicine and art and philosophy and friendship, but they also brought war, refined through millennia of fighting themselves, and they were very good teachers for anyone willing to learn. The cadets learned control that day, but what they really learned was that control means nothing without the capability to abandon it when survival demands adaptation. That was the human lesson. Not tactics or techniques, but the fundamental understanding that rules exist to serve you, not the other way around. And somewhere in those academy guest quarters, a human instructor was probably already planning tomorrow's curriculum, drinking terrible coffee and carrying the weight of teaching young warriors how to be dangerous enough to choose peace, because that's what humans did. They survived, adapted, taught, and hoped that the next generation would be wise enough to use their dangerous gifts sparingly. The story was complete, but the lesson would continue echoing through militaries across the galaxy for generations to come. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who show you not just how to win, but why winning should never be the only goal.